In this video, I am going to discuss your origin, insertion, action practical, kind of explain to you what you need to know for that practical, and go through the origin, insertion, and actions of a few different muscles that you'll be responsible for learning. What I go through is not going to be the entire list of muscles that you're responsible for learning, but it'll give you a good idea of how you want to approach this practical. Okay, now there's some very, very good tools that can help you learn the origins, insertions, and actions of the muscles that you're going to be responsible for. And to find this, you're going to go into Mastering Anatomy and Physiology. You're going to go into the study area in Mastering Anatomy and Physiology, and you're going to click on Animations and Videos. So I'm going to show you that now, that area. Okay, so here we're in the study area home, and here we click on Animations and Videos. After you click on Animations and Videos, you are going to click AP Flicks, and you see it says A&P Flicks with quizzes. You are going to click Origin, Insertion, Action, and Innervation. And from here, you see these are a list of various skeletal muscles with their origins, insertions, and actions. So there are little animations. I'm going to go ahead and I'll click on one of these muscles for you. So I'll click on the Latissimus dorsi, and you can see here that it's going to go through an animation. So
the Latissimus dorsi is the large
you click the play button and you'll see this animation.
Triangular-shaped muscle of the upper limb, which...
Now oftentimes in these videos they're going to give you more information than we're requiring you to learn. They're going to give the innervation, or the nerve that's responsible for controlling these muscles. We're not asking you to learn the innervation for the practical, just the origin, insertion, and actions. Okay, there may be a little bit more detail, some additional actions in these videos that we don't require you to learn. You're only responsible for learning the origins, insertions, and actions that are on the table that's provided to you. Let me show you that that table. Okay, this table here will be provided to you, and this is a table that has a list of the muscles in the left column, the origin of those muscles in the second column, the insertion in the third column, and the action or actions of that muscle in the last column. This is the list that you have to learn. Okay, depending on the class you're in, you may not need to learn all of these muscles. You may only need to learn a portion of them, and your instructor will let you know that when explaining to you the practical. Okay, so we went into animations and videos, AP Flicks with quizzes, and we did origins, insertions, actions, and innervations. Okay, so let's define what an origin is, an insertion, and an action. So the majority of your skeletal muscles, they're called skeletal muscles because they attach to the skeleton. So most of them attach to the skeleton, and when they contract, when a muscle contracts, it changes its length, okay, it shortens, and when the muscle shortens, because it's connected to bones of the skeleton, the bones move because of the contraction of the muscle tissue. Every muscle has at least 2 attachment points, so every muscle is attached to the skeleton at least 2 places. Now, some muscles may be attached to the skeleton at more than 2 places, but every muscle has at least 2 attachment points to the skeleton. And we call those attachment points the origin and the insertion. Now, when we take a look at the origin, the attachment point on the skeleton, where when the muscle contracts, that attachment point doesn't really move, we call that the origin. So this is the muscle's attachment point that is immovable or less movable when it contracts. Okay, these attachment points on the skeleton are often closer to midline than the insertions. Okay, the insertions are usually further away from midline than the origins are. The insertion is the muscle's attachment point that when the muscle contracts, this attachment point moves. So this is the part of the skeleton that moves. Okay, so this is the movable attachment point during contraction. These attachments are often further from midline than the origin. And then the action is, okay, well, when that muscle contracts and the insertion moves and the origin kind of, that bone stays stable, what kind of movement is created? That's what the action is. So what is the joint movement that gets created when the muscle contracts? Okay, and when muscles contract, when they shorten, during a contraction, the muscle insertion often moves toward the origin. And you're going to see this as we work through some of these muscles. These are some examples of different types of contractions. These are examples of different types of joint movements when a skeletal muscle contracts. So if you look up here, we see flexion, and this would be flexion of the shoulder. Okay, this would be flexion of the knee. This would be extension of the shoulder, and this arrow is indicating the direction that this bone, okay, the upper arm bone, would be moving. Extension, this arrow shows the direction that the lower leg bone would be moving. So this would be extension of the knee. Okay. Extension of the neck, flexion of the neck. Okay, so tipping your head forward towards your sternum, that would be flexion. Raising your head up away from your sternum would be extension. And if we go past midline, in other words, we're kind of looking up at the ceiling, that would be what's referred to as hyperextension. These joint movements your instructor will be covering in class during lectures, so I'm not going to go through all of them with you at this time. Okay, but I'll be referring to these joint movements as I explain to you the different muscles, what their origins are, their insertions are, and then I'll be referring to some of these actions. Okay, so we know that all muscles, most muscles attach to the skeleton, and when they do attach to the skeleton, they have at least 2 attachment points. Again, sometimes a muscle may have more than 2 attachment points, okay? But the attachment points are always going to be called the origin and the insertion, okay? Now, if we take a muscle, okay, so I think the majority of you know where your biceps brachii muscle is. So that's the kind of fleshy muscle that lies on the anterior surface of the upper arm. Now we can see that biceps brachii muscle has, if you look at this illustration on the left, the attachment points, okay, the origins would be in red and the insertions would be in blue, okay? So we see that the biceps brachii, okay, biceps brachii muscle, so those, these red points right here, are the origins of the biceps brachii muscle, and the insertion of the biceps brachii muscle is down here on one of the forearm bones. So this is the radius. So you can see that it's got its insertion down here at the radius, and its origin is up here actually on the scapula. Okay, so that would be an example of a muscle's origin and insertion. We can do the same thing. Maybe you know the triceps brachii, that is the fleshy posterior upper arm muscle, and that muscle also has origin and insertion. So let's go ahead and take a look at that at the illustration on the right. So the triceps brachii muscle, okay, we see, remember red is origin, so we see the origin of the triceps brachii muscle up here on the scapula. We also see an origin point for that triceps brachii up here on the proximal humerus. And those would be the origins of that muscle. Okay, and the insertion of that muscle, to find that, we would come down here and we see on this is the ulna, this is the olecranon process of the ulna down here. This would be where the triceps brachii muscle inserts. Okay, All right, so that's just an example of showing us origins versus insertions on different skeletal bones for a few different muscles. Okay, so this again is just going to go through a few of the muscles. I'm going to go through a few of the muscles that you're responsible for learning for your practical. So we see the sternocleidomastoid. So this is a kind of an anterior and lateral neck muscle here. So this is the sternocleidomastoid. The origin of this muscle is the manubrium and the clavicle. So you should remember this from these bones from studying for your skeletal system practical. Here's the manubrium and here's the clavicle. So here we see these two attachment points would be the origins for that sternocleidomastoid, and the insertion is the mastoid process of the temporal bone, which is this kind of large bump that sits just on the inferior portion of the temporal bone, just behind your ear. The action of this muscle is flexion of the head. Okay, so when we say flexion of the head, we see that over here. Remember, flexion of the head is if you were standing in anatomical position and you were standing upright facing forward to bend your chin toward your chest, that would be flexion of the head. This muscle also causes lateral rotation of the head. Lateral rotation of the head, here's an example of lateral rotation. Okay, so this would be right lateral rotation, rotating to this side. This would be left lateral rotation, rotating to that side. So in other words, when you say, when you tell someone no and you shake your head from side to side, you are doing right and left lateral rotation. Those are the actions of the sternocleidomastoid. The psoas major. The psoas major is a very powerful flexor of the hip joint, and we see the psoas major here, so I'll highlight it for you because there's a few different muscles in this picture. So this is the psoas major. Here we see this is the spinal column. This is the majority of these are lumbar vertebrae, and the origin is the transverse processes and the bodies of T12 through L5 vertebrae. So this is T12, the 12th thoracic vertebrae. This is 1, 2, 3, 4. These are 5 lumbar vertebrae. So on the transverse processes and the bodies of these vertebrae, we're going to have a psoas major. It's going to originate there. It will insert into the lesser trochanter of the femur, which is down here, and the action is flexion of the thigh. We see flexion of the thigh over here on this illustration to the left. Again, if you were standing in anatomical position with your foot down here, flexion of the thigh would be taking that foot and lifting it up as if you were maybe going to kick a ball. That would be flexion of the thigh. Throughout this lecture, all of these hyperlinks that you see down below, all these hyperlinks are, if you click on them, are going to take you to the actual animation in mastering that I showed you at the beginning with the animations and videos where you can see animations for different muscles. So I put those in here for you. Okay, you may have to, when you click on the first link, you may have to log into your mastering account to continue accessing those videos as you go through this PowerPoint, and you want to click on and watch each of those videos. So if you were to go ahead and click on this video, let me go back. If you were to go ahead and click on that video, what should come up is the sign-in page for mastering. You're going to go ahead and sign in, and once you sign in, you'll be taken to that video. Okay. The next muscle is the Latissimus dorsi. Origin of the Latissimus dorsi. I remember that the origin is the bone or bones that when the muscle contracts are immovable, or they don't move very much. Okay. The insertion, remember, that is the bone or the bones that the muscle is attached to, that when the muscle contracts, that attachment point or those bones are going to be the movable bones. So we can see that here. The origin of Latissimus dorsi, the spinous process of the lower 6 thoracic and all lumbar vertebrae. So the lower 6 thoracic vertebrae and all the lumbar vertebrae, those spinous processes, as well as the iliac crest. And we can see the iliac crest here. Now these bones are not going to move when that muscle contracts. The insertion, this is going to be the point where when the muscle contracts, this bone will be moving, and it inserts on the intertubercular sulcus of the humerus. Here is the insertion point. The intertubercular sulcus, you should remember, is the groove between the greater and lesser tubercles of the humerus, so runs right here. And the action of this muscle is shoulder adduction, medial rotation of the arm, and shoulder extension. So I'm showing you shoulder extension here. Again, shoulder extension would be if this person's arm was out in front of them and they move their arm backward. Okay, you can see them moving their arm backward would be you'd be moving this attachment point, which is the insertion. So these are the actions. Again, if you want to go to the animation, you can click on that link. The next muscle is the deltoid. Deltoid's origin is the scapula and the clavicle. Okay, so you can see the origin here. So here we see the scapula. Here is the clavicle. Scapula, here's the attachment point of the scapula. If we were to see an anterior view, this is a posterior view here of the scapula and the humerus. If we were to see an anterior view, you would see that the deltoid does attach to about the lateral third or so of the clavicle. The insertion point of the deltoid is the deltoid tuberosity of the humerus. That is the bump about midway down the humerus on the lateral aspect. And the action is shoulder abduction. So here we see shoulder abduction. Abduction, remember, is moving a limb away from midline. So if we start in an anatomical position here and we move the arm up as if we were performing a jumping jack, we're lifting our arm up. That is shoulder abduction, and the deltoid is responsible for that movement. Again, an animation for you to view. The supraspinatus. Supraspinatus, this muscle has an origin in the supraspinous fossa, so that is this kind of flattened or depressed or grooved area just above the spinous process, just above the spine of the scapula. So in this groove right here, we see a big fleshy muscle, that is the supraspinatus. That is its origin. Its insertion is the greater tubercle of the humerus. So we see the insertion right here. The action is when that muscle contracts, it initiates arm abduction. In other words, the beginning about 15 degrees or so of arm abduction or shoulder abduction is the responsibility of the supraspinatus. So this would be abduction as we are attempting to lift our arm up, and then the deltoid is going to take over after about that first 15 degrees or so of abduction of the arm. Again, a link for you to follow. The triceps brachii, the origin of the triceps brachii is the humerus and the scapula. So we saw this when I introduced origin and insertion to you. We saw that here's the triceps brachii right here, this muscle. It's going to originate on the scapula up here and also on the humerus right here, and it will insert down into and onto the olecranon process of the elbow. Okay. Action is extension of the elbow, so we see here extension of the elbow. Here is the elbow. We see the elbow is in this flex position. Extension would be straightening that arm back down. That would be extension of the elbow. Now when we do this, okay, which attachment point is going to be moving? Is the scapula moving? Is the humerus moving? These attachment points? No, they're not. The humerus is stationary. The scapula is stationary, holding the humerus up against wall of the thorax. When we move our arm down, the bone that's moving is our forearm, okay, and that is where the insertion is at the elbow. Okay, so again, just demonstrating that the muscle, the origin of a muscle is when the muscle contracts, those bones or that attachment point is not moving, whereas with the insertion, that attachment point is the one that is moving when the muscle contracts. Again, an animation for you to follow. Biceps brachii, again, I mentioned this one at the outset. This is the large fleshy muscle right here that sits on the anterior aspect of the upper arm. Its origin is the scapula, and I showed you that here. Here's the attachment points here. The scapula, its insertion is the radial tuberosity down here at the radius. Okay, so here's the radius, here's the radial tuberosity. This would be the insertion, and its action is flexion and supination of the elbow. We see flexion here if we started with the arm hanging at the side or in anatomical position, and we lifted that hand up toward the chest. This movement up would be flexion of the elbow. Supination at the elbow would be turning our palm from a palm down position to a palm up position. This is what we refer to as supination, and this movement of turning your palm up towards the sky, that is also accomplished by contraction of the biceps brachii muscle. Another link for you to follow. The rectus femoris muscle. So rectus femoris is this anterior muscle of the quadricep group at the anterior thigh. So we see rectus femoris here. The origin is the ilium. So the ilium is the part of the os coxa. Okay, so remember that the os coxa, or the hip bone, is made of the ilium, the ischium, and the pubis. So the ilium, the anterior inferior iliac spine, okay, up in this position, and its insertion is the patella and the tibial tuberosity. So here we see patella, here we see tibial tuberosity. So these would be the insertion points. The action is knee extension and hip flexion. Again, over here we see knee extension. So knee extension would be as if we were starting in this position where the lower leg were parallel to the ground, and now we're moving the foot toward being an anatomical position. Okay, as if maybe you were kicking a ball by using your movement at your knee joint. Okay, hip flexion, down below we see hip flexion. So here, if we were in anatomical position, if you're following my cursor and we're standing straight up in anatomical position, and then we move the toes forward, we get flexion of the hip there. Both of those movements, hip extension and knee flexion, accomplished by contraction of the rectus femoris. Again, a link for you to follow. Gluteus maximus. So gluteus maximus, the large fleshy muscle, superficial muscle of the buttock region. Origin is going to be ilium, sacrum, and coccyx. So we see here is the iliac crest. So ilium, sacrum lies over here. The coccyx is kind of just below the sacrum. So this is going to be our where the muscle originates. Its insertion is going to be the proximal femur and the IT band. So we see the IT band here. It's going to insert onto the IT band and also onto the femur as well. Action is thigh extension. So again, here, if this person had their thigh or their hip in the flex position and then they move it posteriorly, that would be thigh extension or hip extension. Same thing. Again, a link for you to follow. The gastrocnemius, okay, so the gastrocnemius is one of the two fleshy muscles that make up the calf. The origin is the medial and lateral condyles of the femur. So here is the distal femur. This is the medial condyle. This is the lateral condyle. So these two condyles are where that muscle originates. It inserts into the calcaneus, which is your heel bone, okay, one of the tarsal bones of the foot, via this long tendon right here, which is the Achilles tendon. And the action is plantar flexion of the ankle. Here we see plantar flexion of the ankle. If someone were standing with their foot flat on the ground and they went up they were standing on their toes, or they pointed their toes toward the ground, this is plantar flexion and is accomplished by the gastrocnemius. Again, a link for you to follow. And then finally, the soleus. Soleus is another muscle of the calf. It's more of a broad muscle. It lies just deep to the gastrocnemius. So here for relationship, we can see the gastrocnemius on the left. We see the soleus on the right. The soleus has an origin at the proximal tibia and fibula. So here we see, here's the tibia. We don't really see the fibula because it's kind of behind this lateral portion of the soleus. So proximal tibia and fibula would be the origin. The insertion, again, down on the calcaneus via the Achilles tendon. So both the soleus and the gastrocnemius use that Achilles tendon to insert down onto the calcaneus. So that's their insertion point. Action, again, plantar flexion of the ankle, the same type of action that was accomplished by the gastrocnemius, and a link for you to follow.